This man was blameless and upright. He feared God, and he shunned evil. On another day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to his face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. And his wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. This, my friends, is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Now, our reading from Job begins with the line, "In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job." It sounds almost like the beginning of a folk tale or a fantasy novel. But in actuality, it is the beginning of a deep dive into one of the most profound questions that we as Christians are confronted with. And the question is the nature of good and evil. And by this I mean evil in all its forms. I mean evil that comes from one human perpetrating an atrocity upon another. I mean institutional evil that comes from governing bodies like those that seem so prevalent in the mid-1900s in places like Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia. Both of those dealt death and suffering to untold millions. And I mean natural evil that comes from hurricanes, from volcanoes and forest fires. I mean simple medical problems for which there seems no reason whatsoever. Discussion of this question in theological circles produces something called a theodicy. Now, theodicy is a defense of God's goodness in the face of evil, tragedy, and suffering. And truthfully, it is not only theologians who discuss this, but must cross the mind of anyone who has gone through difficult times. Now, I can remember, even people who haven't gone through difficult times think about these questions. I can remember when I was in college, we'd meet in a dorm room intending on studying, say, macroeconomics. And instead, we would end up talking about subjects like this. And this one actually came up one night when we were talking. But we talked about it mainly because it was more interesting than macroeconomics. There is really little doubt about there being evil in the world. All we have to do is pick up a history book or skim over the news on our computer browser or read about it in the newspaper. You can pick your own medium. On the other hand, the story of Job for us seems rather distant. Almost otherworldly. It starts in a strange place, far from home. And in fact, this story would have been far from home for the Jews as well. Uz is thought to have possibly existed in a place called Edom, south of Israel. It would have seemed slightly exotic, though the circumstances probably would not have been near as foreign to the Jews as it is to us, because they had a similar economy that was based on controlling land, owning animals, and having an abundance of servants. Now, this balance between the familiar and the unfamiliar would have allowed the Israelites, as it allows us, to consider the subject matter in its universal form, seeing how it is applicable to all people, not just to us alone. Now, the next sentence in the verse builds up a bit of tension. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. Now, what story that ever began that way ever had for the next sentence, and he lived happily ever after? Now, that might be the last sentence of the story, but you've got to know there's got to be quite a bit of conflict in between that beginning and the ending. Of course, the nature of a good story, of any good story, is that there be conflict. But the story of Job is one that seems specifically designed to deal with this theodicy question. The rest of the first chapter is not part of our lectionary reading, but I think it's important for the sake of context that I summarize what happened there. God gives Satan permission to afflict Job with all manners of troubles. And Job loses many of his servants and his cattle to a raid by the Sabaeans. Then he loses all his sheep and more of his servants due to a lightning storm. Then the Chaldeans raid and steal all of his camels. And finally, the cruelest blow of all, a windstorm comes along and blows down the house of his eldest son, and the roof caves in and crushes all of his children and grandchildren. And we are left to think, what worse could befall any person? Well, chapter 2 begins with God having a discussion with Satan. And since we are talking about good and evil, I think we need to talk a bit about the way Satan is depicted here. Some have said he's kind of like a prosecuting attorney trying to dig up evidence in a trial. And the Hebrew for ha-satan does mean something like accuser or adversary. But I don't think that is really what's happening. The book of Job reveals Satan as a tempter and a destroyer. The role of Satan, rather, is to be the creator of evil by convincing people to sin. He convinces the Sabaeans to raid Job's property. He convinces the Chaldeans to attack Job's property. He creates the storms that kills his children and destroys Job's life, basically. So in this discussion, God asks Satan if he's considered Job. Well, God and Satan know the response of Job is one that a righteous person would make. Yes, he mourns his losses. He tore his robe and shaved his head, but ultimately he prostrates himself and worships God. Satan then admits that Job has passed the test. He has not rebelled against God in spite of the evil he has seen, but exclaims, skin for skin. Scholars think that skin for skin was a colloquial phrase that meant an equal bet or trade. And Satan is saying here that the test Job has undergone is not a fair one. There is more that Job can suffer. And Satan suggests that should Job's health and life be at risk, then Job will surely curse God to his face. So God allows Satan to put Job to the test yet again. He afflicts Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Now Satan's skin for skin comment takes on a darker meaning. It seems that Job has been caused to suffer through no fault of his own, to the very limits of natural human endurance. Yet Job refuses to forsake God. And his wife, who must be suffering as much as he, cries out to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." And for most people, this would be the final straw. His wife is on the edge of despair, and she would go over except the one keeping her from simply giving up is that last vestige of strength that she sees in her husband. And I think it may be the knowledge that she is depending on him that causes Job to say, and I can see him speaking with tears in his eyes and love in his voice. You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we, and he says, we, accept good from God and not trouble? And maybe it is the sharing of this burden, the sharing of this suffering that keeps him going, allows him to keep the faith so that the author of Job can write, in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. So Job continues to be a righteous man. He continues to worship and honor God in spite of all of his troubles. At least in part because of this spousal relationship. You know, in many ways, I think the whole story of Job hinges on this little conversation between wife and husband. It reveals rather starkly the relational aspect of human life. There is something unconditional about the relationship between Job and his wife. They are one in their suffering, and this is the same relationship that Job has with God. Job, in spite of everything, continues to love and honor God. And ultimately, God's love for us has that same unconditional aspect. Let us turn this whole scenario around. Let us look at it backward. We as humans are all sinners, right? We continually do things that are an affront to God. We do things that it pains God to see, and Jesus Christ had to suffer ultimate death and crucifixion because of our sinful behavior. In a sense, God has the patience of Job, and we are afflicting God. It is God's unconditional love for us, God's integrity, and God's relationship with us that is important. It is God's steadfast love that will bring us salvation in spite of all that we do. And maybe this helps us to understand a little bit about how evil operates in the world. It is certainly not caused by God, who is an active force bringing out all that is good. God created the world, and God created us. And we are made in the image of God. And as such, we have some of the attributes of God. Among these is a will to choose either good or evil. We know that the attributes of God include being all-knowing and all-powerful. Now, those aren't attributes that he gave to us. Taking these two things together, one might suppose that God can correct all evil even at the moment that it is unleashed. Yet this would destroy free will. It may also be asked, if God knows all before it happens, doesn't that mean that a person confronted with a choice is predestined to make that choice? Well, not really. God simply knows a person so well. The choice that person will make is already known. It's kind of like asking a 10-year-old after dinner what they want for dessert. Do they want broccoli or do they want ice cream? 99% of the time, they're going to pick ice cream, and the child that you have that's going to pick broccoli, you might just know that in advance too. But what does Job have to tell us about this? The fact is, with all of this theological talk, we are moving into abstraction. And it is clear from the first 2 chapters of Job that the whole thing is not about what is good and what is evil in the world, but is rather about relationships. It is about relationships of unconditional love that transcend the earthly categorizations of events as good and evil. The fact is, good has to do with loving relationships. That is loving in the sense of agape. Like the relationship between Job and his wife, and the relationship between Job and God. Choosing these relationships is making a right choice. Evil is being separated from the love of God. My friends, it would be a wrong choice to separate ourselves from the love of God. God can rely on Job to be faithful through every event, whether or not it is physically categorized as good or evil. And the same goes for Job. He can rely on God to come through in the end. In fact, Job will ultimately, toward the end of the book, say this very thing. And this passage was written like 1,000 years before the coming of Christ. And this is what Job says. I know that my Redeemer lives, and in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. I and not another. How my heart yearns within me. So Jesus, our Redeemer, has come to earth. And at the cross has won victory over death, so that the evil that we perpetrate upon the world might be forgiven. And Jesus Christ will return so that we will see him with our own eyes. It will be a time when all evil will be eradicated from the earth, and we will walk in the light of Christ forever and ever. Oh, how our hearts yearn within us. O Lord, O Christ, O Holy Spirit, bring us into closer relationship with you. Now let us bow our heads. We praise you, O Lord. The promise we have heard through the mouth of Job is being kept. Lord, open our minds to understand your promises. Open our hearts that we may feel your presence. Open our souls that we might do good in this world.